When we think of the Arthurian legend, we often picture the grand, sweeping tales of the Holy Grail or the tragic downfall of Camelot. But much of the DNA of those stories, the way knights behave, how they love, and how they fight, comes from a single, transformative period in the 12th century. At the center of this transformation was a poet named Chrétien de Troyes. He wasn't just telling stories, he was building a new kind of literature. Before Chrétien, the stories of King Arthur were largely raw, wild Celtic folklore, tales of magic, monsters, and tribal warfare. Chrétien took that ancient, somewhat chaotic material and refined it into something sophisticated, something that spoke directly to the aristocratic courts of his time. He turned myth into romance. To understand the full scope of what he did, we have to look at his 4 major works, Erec, Enide, Cligès, Yvain, and Lancelot. These stories aren't just a collection of adventures, they track a specific kind of development. They follow the knight as he moves from being a young man, seeking glory, to a seasoned warrior navigating the complex, often contradictory, codes of chivalry and courtly love. While each romance has its own unique flavor, they all contribute to a larger project, defining what it meant to be a perfect knight in a changing medieval world. In the earlier works like Erec et Enide or Yvain, we see knights struggling to balance their duties to their lords and their families with their personal quests and their devotion to the women they love. There is a recurring theme of growth here, the idea that a knight must not only be physically strong, but emotionally and socially disciplined. But by the time we reach the Lancelot cycle, the stakes have shifted. The focus moves toward the ultimate test of knightly endurance and the sheer physical reality of combat. The Lancelot stories are particularly fascinating because Chrétien didn't actually finish them. He left the narrative of Lancelot incomplete, leaving the later development of the character to other poets, such as Godefroy de Lagny. Yet, even in the unfinished fragments, he managed to create the quintessential knight. Lancelot is the man who embodies the ideal of the courtly lover, but he is also a man of incredible, almost terrifying physical prowess. He represents the pinnacle of the chivalric code, where the capacity for tenderness in the court is matched by an absolute, unwavering capacity for violence on the battlefield. The climax of the narrative we're looking at today centers on a confrontation that feels much more visceral and grounded than the ethereal magic of earlier legends. It's a duel between Lancelot and a formidable antagonist named Meleagant. Meleagant isn't just a villain, he is a physical and moral challenge to the order of Arthur's court. He is violent, he is driven by rage, and he represents a disruption that only a knight of Lancelot's caliber can resolve. In this conflict, the chivalric code is stripped of its polish and reduced to a question of who can endure the most pain and still keep fighting. The conflict begins in a way that feels almost formal, a joust. In the high-stakes world of chivalry, the joust is a ritualized form of combat, a way to test skill and courage within a structured framework. It is a performance of nobility. But as Lancelot and Meleagant charge at one another, the formality breaks down. The intensity of their collision is so great that both knights are unseated from their horses. This is where the story shifts from the polished ritual of the tournament to the brutal reality of war. The combat devolves into a fight on foot. This isn't a stylized dance, it's a desperate, messy struggle. The horses, caught up in the violence, add to the chaos, their own rage fueling the intensity of the scene. We see the physical toll of this kind of combat very clearly. Lancelot manages to land a decisive, devastating blow, severing Meleagant's right arm. But Meleagant is not easily defeated. Even wounded and enraged, he manages a retaliatory strike that is nothing short of devastating. He hits Lancelot with such force that he breaks the knight's nose guard, knocking Lancelot's teeth loose. It's a moment that pulls the listener out of the idea of the superhuman knight and reminds us that these men are flesh and blood, subject to pain and injury. The victory isn't a clean, effortless triumph, it is a grueling war of attrition. Ultimately, the duel ends in a way that is both violent and final. Lancelot prevails by decapitating Meleagant. It is a shocking, decisive end to the conflict. This act of violence serves a dual purpose. It restores order to King Arthur's court, and it cements Lancelot's reputation as a man capable of overcoming even the most savage opposition. The tension that has been building in the court is released in a burst of jubilation. The threat is gone, the social order is restored, and Lancelot has proven himself through blood and endurance. When we step back from the blood and the steel of that duel, we can see what Chrétien was actually doing with these stories. He was constructing a social blueprint. The 12th century aristocracy was a class of people who were increasingly trying to define their own identity. They wanted to move away from the old, tribal ways of the warrior and toward a more refined, courtly existence. They needed a code, a set of rules for how a man should act in battle, how he should treat his king, and, perhaps most importantly, how he should conduct himself in the presence of a lady. Chrétien's Romances provided that code. He took the matière de Bretagne, the raw matter of Britain, and polished it. He took the old, jagged edges of Celtic myth and smoothed them into the elegant, structured verse of the courtly romance. By writing in poetry rather than prose, he gave these stories a rhythmic, elevated quality that mirrored the refinement of the courts he was writing for. In doing so, he created a literary language for the nobility. There is a profound duality at work in these texts. On one hand, you have the high ideals of courtly love, the idea of the knight being transformed by his devotion to a lady, becoming more refined, more sensitive, more civilized. On the other hand, you have the visceral, often brutal reality of the combat itself. Lancelot is a man of extreme refinement, yet he is also a man who can decapitate an enemy in a muddy, tooth-shattering fight. Chrétien seems to suggest that these two things aren't actually in opposition. To be a true knight, you must be able to navigate both the delicate nuances of the court and the brutal realities of the battlefield. You have to be able to love with intensity, but you also have to be able to kill with precision. This tension is what gives the Arthurian legend its lasting power. It isn't just a series of fairy tales, it's a study of the human condition under the pressure of extreme social and physical demands. We see characters struggling with the weight of their lineage and the expectations of their station. We see how familial conflicts, like the complex relationships between Arthur, his sister, and figures like King Lot, drive the political and narrative tension of the world. Lot, as Arthur's brother-in-law and the father of Gawain, serves as a reminder that the world of chivalry is built on a foundation of family ties and political alliances, often fraught with rebellion and betrayal. These genealogical connections provide the social legitimacy for the knight's actions, grounding the fantastical quests in a recognizable social hierarchy. It's also worth noting how these stories functioned as a bridge. Chrétien's work in Old French laid the foundation for much of what would follow in Middle English literature. The themes he established, the quest, the testing of the soul, the tension between desire and duty, became the standard vocabulary for Western storytelling. He took the fragmented nature of early folklore and gave it a narrative trajectory that later writers could build upon for centuries. Even though his work on Lancelot was left unfinished, the core of the character was so strong that he became the most enduring figure in the entire cycle, the gold standard against which all other knights were measured. As we look back on these 4 romances, we see more than just stories about knights in shining armor. We see the moment when literature began to codify the ideals of a whole class of people. We see the transformation of myth into something that could be used to teach, to entertain, and to define a culture. Chrétien de Troyes took the wild, unpredictable magic of the old world and gave it a structure, a grace, and a violent, beautiful reality that still resonates today. He gave us the Arthurian legend as we know it, a world where the highest ideals of love and honor are constantly being tested by the very real, very brutal, reality of the human heart and the human sword.